Good evening. My name is Jennifer Farrell, Jordan Schnitzer Curator in the Department of Drawings and Prints, and I want to thank you for joining us to celebrate the art of John Wilson on this very cold night. So this is really extra special that everyone is here. You can see our wonderful panelists. I'm going to begin the introductions. And a little bit of a preface. For over 6 decades, John Wilson sought to portray what he called a universal humanity. Working in a figurative style, he made powerful and poetic works that captured his life as a Black American artist and his ongoing quest for racial, social, and economic justice. His art reflected on and responded to the turbulent times in which he lived and continues to resonate today. While still a teenager, Wilson was struck by the absence of positive representations of Black Americans and their experiences in both museums and popular culture. To counter such prejudices and omissions, he centered the experiences of Black Americans, creating images that portrayed dignity, strength, and love. With incredible skill and vision, Wilson employed a variety of mediums and techniques to portray the best and the worst of humanity. He evoked what Antonio Gramsci referred to as the pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. That is an unflinching, sober view of the world and also a belief in and dedication to change. When we began to develop an exhibition of John Wilson's work in the winter of 2021 through early 2022, we felt a profound sense of urgency to really explore this powerful artist's work. In fact, I told several colleagues that if we do not do this exhibition, someone else will. And it turns out that my colleagues at the MFA Boston, Edward Saywell and Patrick Murphy, were having that same conversation with their director about John Wilson. So when we learned of each other's plans, we decided to collaborate. We soon added Dr. Leslie King-Hammond as a co-curator, and Team Wilson was born. Given the exhibitions at the MFA and the Met and the attention they have generated, it would be easy to say that John Wilson's time has come. But the truth is, it was always his time. Witnessing Humanity, the art of John Wilson, will be on view through this Sunday, February 2nd. The museum is closed tomorrow, but we do have evening hours on Friday and Saturday night. And I encourage you to visit, or to visit again, or to visit with many of your friends. The program tonight is sponsored by the IFPDA, and the exhibition is made possible by the Enterprise Holdings Endowment, the Mellon Foundation, and Dave Williams in memory of Reba Williams. At the Met, I would like to thank my many wonderful and talented colleagues across the museum, with particular thanks to Nadine Orenstein, Quincy Houghton, Heidi Holder, and Max Holine, the Marina and Kellen French director and CEO, for being such enthusiastic advocates for this exhibition. I also want to acknowledge Martha Richardson, who provided invaluable guidance, support, cheer, and materials. We are also grateful for the advice of Edmund Barry Gaither and Lisa Hodomarsky. This show would not be possible without the help of John Wilson's family, in particular his children, Erica and Roy, and widow Julie Wilson, who generously shared their memories and art with us. Now, on to tonight's discussion. I am thrilled to introduce the incredible speakers, who I should note all ask for very short introductions. As one panelist said, quote, "They can Google us," end quote. So with that, Dr. Leslie King-Hammond, who will be moderating, is Professor Emerita, Founding Director, Center for Race and Culture, and former Graduate Dean, Maryland Institute College of Art. She is an art historian, curator, artist, and community innovator, and co-curator for Witnessing Humanity, the art of John Wilson, and it's been an absolute pleasure to work with her. And in alphabetical order, the speakers are: Derrick Adams is a multidisciplinary artist living and working in Brooklyn, New York. He serves as a tenured professor in the School of Visual, Media, and Performing Arts at the City University of New York, Brooklyn College. Lisa Farrington is Distinguished Professor Emerita at CUNY and a leading historian of African American art. Her award-winning books include 2 major Black art and women's surveys for Oxford University Press, and most recently, Black Artists in Their Own Words for the University of California, and The World Before Racism for Artists Book Foundation. Lowery Stokes Sims is an independent art historian and curator. She previously served as executive director and president of the Studio Museum in Harlem. Now I'm going to go off script a bit to say that she was also an incredible curator and colleague to many at the Met, who greatly enriched the museum through her vision, advocacy, mentorship, and her excellent exhibitions and acquisitions. And I cannot tell you how many times I go to pull an object file and see that it was Lowery who brought the work to the Met. So her legacy lives on in so many ways, and for that we are all incredibly grateful. So with that, I will turn it over to our wonderful panel. Thank you.
I am so thrilled to see an audience filled with people hopefully as passionate as we are about this subject. I am so blessed to have worked with Jennifer Farrell, who I thank for her support, in Team Wilson, as I called ourselves, as well as Edward Saywell and Patrick Murphy at the MFA Boston, where this exhibition began. We are at the point now, we are in a critical state in our country where erasure is becoming an idea, a concept that certain elements which to normalize. At this particular time, we are especially blessed to have had so many incredible reviews of this exhibition, not only in Boston, but here in New York and throughout our websites. So without further ado, I go to my panelists who I handpicked. I wanted to make sure we had the right voices for the right moment, talking about the right artist.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming out on this cold night. I myself would be home watching Hallmark movies, but you have to do your own thing. So I want to begin this discussion referencing the conversation I had with the eminent curator, activist, and art historian, Edmund Barry Gaither, and do buy the catalog, because Barry's interview is like incredible. And I asked him, I said, how should we position John Wilson in 20th century art? And Barry declared that the proper way to locate him was within the context of the powerful political and social sentiments of the first half of the 20th century, and in the most important cultural and political movement of the 20th century, which was the construction of a tradition of Black figuration. Barry noted further that while in the larger art world, there was a revolt against, Renaissance and Baroque representation, for African Americans, what was revolutionary was the recovery of the dignity of their images to counter the distorted images of Blacks in advertising, media, and popular imagery that often denied their humanity. Even a brief survey of these approaches to the Black figure indicates a great variety of stylistic philosophies, from expressionistic manipulations of William H. Johnson, lesser so by Lois Mailloux Jones, to the mimetic realism of Archibald Motley. Now, Barry, in the interview, specifically associates Wilson's work with that of Charles White, John Biggers, as well as Elizabeth Catlett, who we will come to presently. We can also see Wilson's congruity with fellow Bostonian Alan Cripe or William H. Johnson in this depiction of street scenes. And I had the privilege of working with the MFA on a book on their collection of Black artists. And one can postulate the importance of these street scenes as indicating a sense of agency that African Americans felt over the spaces that they lived in and worked as they moved into urban areas, particularly in the north of the United States. I need not remind you that these images effectively rescued the Black body from the exoticizing early 20th century appropriation of Africanness, what Patrine Archer Shore described as negrophilia, my favorite word, in a broad spectrum of expressions. We had cubism, jazz, entertainment, Blackbirds, and Josephine Baker. And do not jump on my bones about Josephine Baker, because I know she's a feminist and that she's also accommodating the exoticism of the day. That's another conversation. So don't. So in the work of Black artists between the wars and in the 50s and 60s, what we see is a continuation of the assertions of the positive affirmative imaging of the Black body that marked the Harlem Renaissance in the epoch in which the movement for civil rights and liberation from colonialism gained momentum. And in this, these artists shared the goal of their older contemporary, Wilfredo Long, in Cuba in the 1940s and 50s, whose career is being celebrated just down the street at the Museum of Modern Art. Now, if you've read the excellent catalog of the exhibition, or at least the reviews of the press, the consistent point made about Wilson is its projection of a sense of humanity. This is not an idealistic humanity that overlooks the foibles, frustrations, cruelties, and existential truth that comprises human existence, as we see in images such as streetcar, scene, street worker, or Jimmy. Here we see the tensions of public interactions, the vagaries of work opportunities, and perhaps the weight of dealing with all this that are palpable in these images. But regardless of their existential situation, these figures exude a quiet dignity and pride, defying the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Barry Gaither suggests that Wilson's perspective came not only from his existential condition as a Black man in America, but also from the perspectives of his immigrant parents who had transitioned to positions in American society vastly different from what they would have merited in their native Guyana. And I would recommend to you the really excellent article on Wilson and Richard Wright, which just was published in Hyperallergic this morning by A.G. Sims, no relationship as I know, and also the essay by Joseph Manigault Bryant about the Richard Wright series in the catalog. I get 10% for every sale of the catalog. Now, that being said, it's interesting to consider this study for the incident. It's a modest painting in the galleries, painted in '52, while Wilson was a student at La Esmeralda, Mexico's National School of Art. The mural is no longer extant, but we can rely on Wilson's sketches and painted studies for it. The mural depicted the scene of lynching at the hands of the Ku Klux Klan as witnessed by a young African-American family. And Wilson was undoubtedly inspired by the political and social activism of the Mexican muralists, particularly Jose Clemente Orozco, and the images of lynchings he had seen in newspapers as a child. Wilson revisited the subject of the incident many times over the years as a way of grappling with racial violence, both past and present. So I think that this subject matter belongs in a chronology of artists dealing with this subject. In 1935, you may not know, there were 2 exhibitions on lynchings here in New York City. One organized at the NAACP, by the NAACP at the Newton Galleries, and the other by the Artists Union and the John Reed Club at the American Contemporary Art Gallery. These exhibitions included the work of myriad artists, including Isamu Noguchi, who you can see here, and others. Now, what I find is so interesting is that relatively few of the depictions in both of those exhibitions included figures of the Ku Klux Klan, as we can see in Philip Guston's drawing for his 1930s paintings, Conspirators. Rightfully, the focus is on the figure of the lynched victim, and in this vein, we can consider the contorted figure by Noguchi, which was in that exhibition, as well as the dignified resignation of Lois Mailloux Jones' 1944 mob victim meditation. But there's something about including the Ku Klux Klan that really implicates the perpetrators of the violence on the bodies of the two figures in the Noguchi and the Jones. Now, we always talk about Wilson's sojourn in Paris in 1947-49 and his study with the French painter Fernand Léger. Now, this is interesting because Léger although he was a pioneer among artist art, he always maintained a figural impulse. He stayed in the United States during the war, returned to France in 1945, and as historian Carlotta Cotique has noted, he now had a determination to depict the common man as well as to create for him. And that was the result of socialist theories widespread among the avant-garde, both before and after World War II. However, according to Cotique, Léger's social consciousness was not that of a fierce Marxist, but of a passionate humanist. Barry Gaither noted in our conversation that Wilson chose to go to Léger's studio because he was interested in murals. Desiree Fillmore notes in her essay in the exhibition catalog that Léger encouraged Wilson to shift his ambitions from creating faithful, naturalistic renderings of his subjects to focus on the core elements of the natural world through the simplest of visual terms, color, line, and form. So Gaither again notes that Wilson digested that, incorporated it into his work, and in that sense, his work acquired a monumentality no matter the scale of the rendering because the architectural underpinning is infinitely expandable. So even when working on the scale of a lithograph, Wilson creates compositions that were monumental and mural-like. For example, we can look at the 1943 Deliver Us from Evil, which is, as noted on the Met's website, Wilson's outspoken commentary on the unequal responses to injustices at home and abroad. It's divided into two halves, and the artist juxtaposes scenes of the war in Europe and the Holocaust on the left, and the persecution and killing of blacks in the United States at the right. Like many African Americans at the time, Wilson supported the government's war effort, but was angry that no reciprocal fight for freedom was being made on the home front. When I looked at this composition, I really immediately thought of Ben Shaw's 1937-38 mural, Jersey Homesteads, which was at the Roosevelt Public School in Roosevelt, New Jersey. Of course, done under the auspices of the Works Progress Administration. This is a study that indicates how the composition conveys immigrant hopefulness. The final fresco, however, included caskets in the upper left with the bodies of Sacco and Vanzetti, who were two Italian immigrants who were tried for robbery and murder with flimsy evidence and being condemned for being Italian immigrants and anarchists. So Shawn, like Wilson, leads us to the consideration that even in a free society, we must remain vigilant and temper our idealism with realism. Sideline, just remember, Bob Colescott, a special love of mine. He was also studied in Paris in Léger's studio in 1949 on the GI Bill. I was interested to see that Lizetta LaFall Collins said that Wilson and Colescott met and that they both were part of a group that Léger worked with privately. So on the left, you can see a work that Colescott did in grad school in Berkeley, his work in Léger's atelier in the middle. And one can say that Léger indeed set Colescott on a journey to his signature style, which, despite its funky figuration, maintained a sense of architectural underpinning that Barry Gaither mentioned. If we were to choose a especially compatible spirit for Wilson, it certainly would be Elizabeth Catlett. Wilson spent 6 years in Mexico, 1950 to 1956, And at this time, he's reconnecting with Catlett and her husband, Francisco Mora, whom he met briefly in Boston in 1946. Wilson worked making prints in the Taller Gráfica Popular, where Catlett and Mora were influential presences. I've done considerable reflection on how Catlett reflected a choreography of Black women's bodily expressions, and I think we can say that Wilson did something similar for the Black male body. As we look at these images, we need to take note that Wilson revealed in lectures and statements that these images reflected his own sense of alienation and that such figures can be seen as surrogates for him. So while Barry Gaither would demur on assigning a politically activist position to Wilson, in their introductory essay, the exhibition curators note that he was involved in leftist organizations and the Progressive Party. They also make note of his special interest in subject matters dealing with labor and the working class, and that was something he certainly shared with Catlett. Now, as been emphasized in the various reviews of this exhibition, the special aspect of Wilson's work is that it stands out in his oeuvre is his treatment of the father and child, particularly the father and son relationship. As our noted moderator, Leslie King-Hammond, writes in her essay in the catalog, quote, "Among the many fallacies posed in American culture is that there is not a capacity for a valuable Black family experience. This was not the case for Wilson, whose familial relationships seeded in him a strong sense of self-worth and confidence." So I think that Catlett and Wilson and even Long provided to a younger generation of artists in the 60s and 70s who were engaged simultaneously in political liberation and cultural reclamation and their ancestral roots. We can take special note of Joseph Norman, who is here with us. Joseph, please stand up. Joseph had a two-person exhibition with Wilson in 1995. There's also Napoleon Jones Henderson, who we just tragically lost recently, and Dana Chandler, who's thriving in Arizona, as I understand. And all of these have contributed memoirs in the catalog again, and I know that Derrick will discuss his own relationship with John Wilson and his work. So, in conclusion, with a longer lens, we consider how Wilson's perspective and attitude have import for this generation of global Black, African, and African American artists who have emerged over the last decade and a half and have probed the Black figure on its own terms and expression. When the subject of these artists came up in our conversation, Barry's observation is particularly apt. Quote, he said, "We're brought up against real crises. It makes us realize how essential the elements of community and humanity are for any kind of balance. And all of a sudden, it makes celebrity seem thin. In essence, that is the enduring legacy of John Wilson." Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Oh, my mic, right. Hello, everyone. Well, I was so engrossed, I have to say. I kind of lost my train of thought. What I'm showing you here, as should be obvious, is a photograph of Wilson's wife and child, and Wilson's painting, which does something very interesting to the photograph. First of all, as Dr. Lowery Sims has already mentioned, he monumentalizes figures, giving us this feeling that they're larger than life. And that does come directly out of his experience in Mexico with the great muralists who did precisely that, monumentalize the ordinary person. So what I'm showing you here in the painting is this very distinct approach to John Wilson's actual family, which was interracial marriage with biracial children, which interestingly enough brought me to this project because I have known the curator and Dr. Lowery Sims since I was a teenager, before I even ever thought of doing art history. They knew my family, and my parents, who were married at almost the exact same time as Wilson married his white wife, my father and mother married in New York. They had extremely similar experiences. They were urban, living in Boston and then in New York. Both my mother and, this sounds kind of egocentric for me to be talking about my family, but that really is the reason I was one of the reasons I was brought into this project. I am a lifelong historian of African American art. I identify clearly as Black, but I am the daughter of an Irish mother and a Black father, and I have this really cool pictures to show you. That's my mom and dad, and that's my my father rather, holding my sister Leslie in his arms right after she was born. Now think about this. You're a Black man in the 1950s. You have this biracial child and this white wife. During a period when for at least another 10 years, it will be illegal for you to be married to your white wife in 17 states. So on top of all of that, you have to have the self-possession to know what it is that you're going to do with your life. And for anyone to say, I'm going to be an artist in 1950s, that's tricky. If you're a Black man, that's impossible, you know. I would like to mention that one of the reasons I ended up going to art school when I was 13, I came into the city to go to art and design high school, is because my father was an artist. He would help me draw things. He would do my book covers. And nobody knew this about him because he was a big Black guy who worked at the post office. You know, so he never had this vision that Wilson had. The thought never crossed his mind to become an artist, even though he was quite talented. I wish he had known Wilson. Anyway, that little baby in my dad's arms, imagine being him walking around with that baby, another big problem in Manhattan. But I'm losing my train of thought here, looking at my dad. So my sister, that little baby, she and I co-wrote one of the chapters in the catalog. And we came at the topic from my point of view, how do you represent the Black family in African American art, and what makes Wilson's way of representing that family so completely different from virtually every other African American artist who was representing the Black family, which we'll talk about in just a second. And then, of course, my sister, Leslie, Dr. Leslie Farrington, she's a retired OBGYN and a strong advocate for birth rights for women, particularly women of color. And as you may or may not know, women of color, particularly Black women, die in childbirth in New York City 12 times more often than white women, no matter what their financial situation, no matter what their education. So that's a kind of so this is a lot for me to say in 10 minutes. I'm going, okay. So, so let's take a look at the painting. Gosh, this is so amazing because the point of view of the incident is from inside the home of the Black family. The father is ready to kill to protect his wife and child. He is looking outside at the Ku Klux Klan, who are merrily lynching a Black man and holding the severed rope proudly like a trophy. This is a very intense image not just of brutality against blacks, but of a black man who has a white wife, a biracial child, and a gun, and he is going to protect his family no matter what. I have not seen, I may be missing something, but I've been a scholar of African American art for well over 30 years. I don't know of another image that comes close to this in that regard. Second thing, I'm putting like a semester's worth of talk in this 10 minutes. Second thing, take a look at the mother. This is a kind of psychoanalytic look at what she's doing. I talk about in my part of the essay about how she both looks forward and askance, and she has fear on her face, and she has her arm around her child like a death grip. I mean, that you cannot pry that baby out of her arms. And it is because she is looking to this child's future. How will she protect her child? Because the scene outside of the house is the child's future, or potentially, you see. So she is trying to prevent that child from being harmed. And in such an intensely psychological way, in fact, Freud talks about, yeah, I know Freud's not perfect. Okay, that's the second time that phone rang. Turn that off, okay. It's a loud ring, too. Figure that out. So, and I'm holding my mic like this because the tech guy up there said, hold it like this. So I'm not like a stiff person normally. Okay, so in Freudian psychology, there is this image of a woman pulling a baby into her guts, which is a psychological return to the womb. Because in the womb, you are safe, yes? But as my sister's half of the essay points out, and as I just mentioned, you are not necessarily, if you're, breathing while black, safe even in the womb. And I'm going to move forward. I'll come back to this. I'll come back to that. I'll come back to that. Okay. Here's another wonderful metaphor image of a woman wrapped over her child in this protective stance. That I've seen more than once. Mothers literally trying to protect the child by preventing it from even being born. But another image, I don't know if it's in my chapter or not, but another well-known image by Fuller, Mary Turner. It shows, yeah, it's a very elegant, kind of beautiful interpretation of an actual event that took place in 1917 or 18, something like that. A woman, Mary Turner's husband, was lynched in Georgia, I think. And she went around calling the police and trying to protest, and because it was, just such a horrific experience. She was pregnant, Mary Turner, and she was kidnapped by the lynchers, hung up by her feet, her ankles, to a tree. This is a true story. Shot, burned to death while hanging, and then her baby was cut out of her stomach and stomped to death. So when my sister writes in the catalog about birth rights, about protection of black children, this is still a very real thing. There is no explanation other than when the doctor looks at a black woman, he does not see a human, that one would have that statistic that black women are dying. Serena Williams wrote an article about, she is a multi-millionaire, and she had exactly the same experience when birthing her child, almost died. So let's go back to, I show these other images that were typical of the era of between the 30s and, let's say, the 60s, of how African American families were portrayed. Very benign, very sort of wonderfully calm and elegant and beautiful, but not angry. This man is angry. John Wilson is angry, and he wants the world to know how dangerous it is to even be a black family. And he's in Mexico. He's seeing images of these things from his childhood, from sort of powerful images of racial tensions in Mexico. And then, of course, he's living it. In New York City, I assume it was very similar in Boston. I have the exact statistic in the chapter. But in New York City, when I was growing up, in the 50s and 60s, my parents had to give my brother instructions on how to leave the house, how to walk, how to talk. What do you do if a policeman stops you? Because of all the police killings that were taking place while we were young people, the vast majority, something like 60%, even though New York City at that time only had 12% black people, 60% of the killings were young black men, just shooting them. Oh, they're still doing that, by the way. So the power in John Wilson is that he encapsulates a reality that other African American artists are not as brave enough, or maybe they don't see it that way, I'm not sure. They lived it that way, certainly. He encapsulates a reality of danger and violence that one had to endure and survive, like being in a war zone. I don't think people understand necessarily how completely different this image is from any other images that were being made at the time. But I strongly encourage you to go up to the gallery and look. Thank you.
First, I want to say that I'm very honored to be on the panel with such amazing scholars. As an artist, an educator, my contribution was really more reflective when you think about Wilson's work and then his impression on me as an artist and just my generation of artists. Just going back a little bit about, just how I came to be in the space that I occupy. I had the privilege of entering the art world from a nonprofit perspective or community, which for that, the definition is mean no money. So my introduction into art was based on community, what people call social practice now. It's something that most artists, black artists primarily, and black organizations were participating in the beginning because there was no conversation about money or profit. So with that experience, it was somewhat a blessing for me as a young artist to be in a space where I both saw artists create works that represented just and injustice simultaneously. So I was basically in the middle of this amazing space with artists like Ed Clark and Frank Bowling and Haldane and Pendel and so many artists when I worked at a nonprofit gallery in Chelsea called Rush Arts Gallery. And so my very important lesson that I believe fueled the work that people see coming out of me and coming, in the world is really the conversations that I had the privilege to be a part of with these artists. So there were things that were said one-on-one when they visited me in the gallery, when I was there by myself as the director of the gallery. And we had all these amazing conversations about travel. Ed Clark talked about living in Paris and being in Egypt. And then the conversations would sometimes switch to the challenges of being a black artist at certain times and expectations and things that they assumed would happen for them because they were doing all the right things and going to the idea of all the right things. All the right things for me meant addressing all the concerns, both within the black community and what's happening politically, and also having the freedom and privilege of making what you envision in your mind as an artist. Those things are totally, we're totally in a battle as black artists when we're trying to express the duality of blackness and our experiences that we have. We have many different experiences, and it's almost like when black families, black communities, we have a conversation that's an inside conversation, and then we have an outside conversation. And a lot of black artists kind of occupy those spaces, primarily looking at Wilson's work, where you see this need and desire to capture what's happening politically in the world, but also what's happening intimately at home with family. Those two things will happen simultaneously with artists like himself, Catlett, Lawrence, all in this space wanting to think about the formality of being an artist. Also wanting to think about the way of composition, wanting to think about the way of color, form, and content, of course, and all those things kind of occupying your mind at the same time. And for me, looking at Wilson's work, he's one of the quiet storms of all the artists of that generation. His work touched upon a lot of important topics that, for most artists, my generation, we are very familiar with the work, but a lot of us are not always familiar with the artist. What was interesting about his work is that the images were so iconic, the objects were so iconic, that they just looked like they belong where they were, like they've been there. Nothing that I've seen of the works that I've studied or came to know looked like they were inserted. It almost seems like they were part of the environment of defining what was happening in the space and how you were able to walk in the space and be a part of experience and conversations happening within the space of individuals who may or may not necessarily been related to the work. For instance, the MLK sculpture in the White House. That's a sculpture that most people who are aware, visually aware, seen the sculpture before. Actually, the painting right here called Just, actually is a depiction of the sculpture in a ghostly figure in a park. And I put this sculpture outside in a park with this couple who I happened to come across one day when I was doing a photo shoot in Fort Greene Park. And it was such an interesting thing to view. It was a young black couple. I don't know if they even knew each other. It was a woman. She came with her hammock that was in a bag. And then some guy came up and he was trying to help her attach it to the tree. And in between the photo shoot and the photographer, I kept looking over there to see, like, will they get it done? What's going on over here with this couple trying to do this hammock over there, right? And I was with my really good friend, Micheline Thomas. We were doing a photo shoot together for some publication. And I kept looking at them. I was really just focused on these two people. I don't know if they're a couple, but I know the guy was really trying to help this young black woman with the hammock. And then, I kind of lost my focus on them. And maybe 30 minutes later, I just see legs hanging out of the hammock. And I said to Micheline, this looks like a painting. And I said, I'm going to paint it. And that's kind of the origin of this work. And my work overall kind of pulls from a lot of different sources. But one thing that I find is very important as an artist is the ability to project forward, to project ideas that will empower artists, people to see the complexity of black experience that's not compared or juxtaposed or anything that has to do with feeling outside of anywhere, but prioritizing and centering it. And I was fortunate to be in a space as a young artist to be around artists who I felt helped me to be centered through their experience of talking about their overall life and the plight of becoming who they are. Because for me, I looked at them all like they were gods talking to me. I would just be, Frank Boland would call me at work and he would say, "What are you doing, young Derrick, after work?" And he had a studio in Dumbo. And he was like, "Come by the studio and have a beer." And I was like, oh my God, Frank Boland wants to have a beer with me. And I would go and hang out in the studio, and he would tell me all the different things. He would talk about how he started out, how, who were some of his peers who he saw excel because of them not being a black artist that he shared spaces with. That he was at, it would just be a conversation where I was just privileged to sit in the room and to hear the unpacking of the challenges of some artists. Even some artists would come to my studio, would come to my job at the gallery, and sometimes they would cry. They would talk about like their whatever thing. They would say, and I would always think when I'm looking at them, because I would think to them like, don't you know how important you are? Like, you don't know, because the idea of these artists, the monetary part was removed. And so when you think about artists making work for 40 years without any recognition, artists making work for 40 years without any visibility and still making art, that to me is what I aspire to as an artist. And from being in that environment with them, I felt it was my obligation to talk about the other side of the conversation that we have inside as black people with my work. So there are things that are happening within black culture that we, because of the struggle, because of the opposition, that we take for granted, that we participate in with our family and our community, that are actually the saving grace of who we are as humans, and actually adds to the complexity of how we're able to deal with the shit that we deal with. If we did not have the things, my work is about deliberately taking happiness. My work is about deliberately taking what we deserve. Yes. My work is political because I'm not making work to prove anything to anybody or to talk about a juxtaposition of anything that existed prior to what I'm doing. I'm centering what I think is the priority of what I want people to know. And I don't do it in a way that's literal. I do it in a way that you need to learn. You need to look at it. You need to study it. You need to understand. This particular painting is a celebration of Baynard Ruxton. And it was, this is Mr. Soul. Yes, so much to celebrate. And so a lot of my practice is really based on looking at historical documentation with media, looking at things that I felt empowered to see and wondering, like, for instance, like, how do other people not know this thing? And also studying the way that visual culture is like a dessert, like a cake. Like when you eat a good cake, you don't know what's the ingredients in it most of the time. You don't know how much work it took to make it. You don't know how long it's gonna last. You don't know a lot of things about the chef or how they made it. But the winning part of it is that it tastes good. That it smells great, you enjoy it, you want a big slice of it. And to me, I think that to me is the visual art that I'm interested in making. And of course, a lot of ingredients come from a lot of different places. A lot of things that we partake in have historical relevance that we should be interested in. But I learned from being around those artists and hearing their story and looking at the works that they've made and put in the world to talk about struggle and talk about the political unrest that they had experienced in the time that they lived. And I look at that work and I say, the people still haven't learned from this work. People still have not learned from this explicit education of what existed in this time. And as black people, we have to really think about what else we want our next generation to know. There's many things they should know. They should definitely know about the struggle. They should know about the unrest. They should know that this thing that we're experiencing is not new. They should know all these things. And honestly, all my peers do a great job with that. But I also know that young people in the future need to know there's a black artist making this kind of stuff and understand why I made it. I didn't make it because I did not understand what was happening or what was important or what was not important. I believe that black people need a break. And I think that we should have a place we should have a choice of how we engage with our own culture. We should have the option to step into spaces where we can be informed in ways that we feel will be empowering for us to be informed. And one thing that I really noticed as an artist, you know, black people representations in museums are the most vulnerable. They're the most exposed than most cultures because everything that we've experienced is usually very visible when you walk into a museum. There's no compartmentalizing of certain things. It's basically our diary put into the world. For a white person coming to a museum, it could be like, let's look at this work and then we're gonna have lunch. We're gonna look at the flower paintings. We're gonna look at Matisse, or we're gonna look at whatever. And that's the privilege of doing that. And as a black artist, we wanna have that privilege as well, to be able to make those things and look at those things critically and enjoy those things. And so when I look at Wilson's work, with the complexity of the whole thing, the MLK piece is what inspired me the most. That piece, I didn't even know what size it was when I first saw it. But when I saw it for the first time, I was like, who made that piece? I said, and I said to myself, I hope it was a black artist. That's what I said to myself. I said, because that piece is holding that whole room. And he's in the room. And he's judging what's going on in the room. And he's very observant of what's going on in the room. And to me, that's what I think, how I envision my work operating within the world. Being a witness, being a survivor, being a conduit, and being a projectionist. And so I can flip through my work. There's another piece. Like all of my works deal with some level of colonialism. It talks about, the way that we have to digest it, the way that we have to live through it. This particular piece is a genie in a bottle. In the back of it is a tourist cruise ship going by. When people look at my work, they say, it's black joy. And there's a lot of things in my work that is very joyful. But I believe, just like black culture, we take the bitter with the sweet. We can't stop, with the saying, we can't start laughing from crying. All those things are part of the culture in which I feel is the foundation of my creative practice. And so when I'm in my studio, I'm trying to take all of this stuff, all of this junk, all of this trauma, all of this love, all of this hate, all of these things that are the result of our survival, and put them into something where when you see it, you spend time with it, you learn it, you dissect it, you study it. It's not right there for you just to give it to you right away. It's for you to learn. So when you look at things that I create and the things that I think about, they are definitely an extension of all of these artists who have informed my work, people I've been inspired by, but they also are talking about how we also can be forward projectionists when it comes to what we want people to know about black culture in the future. Thank you.
As the African American curator on this exhibition, I was especially informed by three very empathetic white curators, where they listened carefully to me about what I felt was necessary to position this artist within the canon of American art, not just African American art, American art. The difficulty in this genre that we are in, the artists and the art historians, is that you all miss the love, the passion. Maybe you sort of got it from them because they are a little bit intense. And I did deliberately pick each and every one of them, okay? And I applaud them for trying to stay within their time limits. And I also suggested that we not introduce them in between each presentation because I knew this was going to happen, that they had a lot to offer, a lot to give. So when this exhibition came up as an option, and she made me do it because the first thing she says when she's approached first by the curators about talking about how they were going to do the John Wilson show, first thing she says is, "Oh no, I do not do printmakers." She says, "I'm putting you on this Zoom call." That means that she is expecting me to pick up the torch, which I did. But what I wanted to do as my role, my contribution in this, humongous, iconic, classic exhibition, which has received enormous praise from the critics, is that I wanted to also have voices in the catalog that were authentic, that addressed the agency, the role, the commitment, and they could talk about what Derrick has so beautifully talked about, and Lisa and Lowery, is the interiority of the diversity and the range of the Black experience. From the horror and the trauma to the passion and the empathy of love. We are truth tellers. We are wisdom keepers. Don't ask us what we think unless you really want to hear it. Because this crew will let you know, point blank, having researched and done all of the required homework to make sure the presentation is as accurate. I remember when you did an installation for Jacob Lawrence. Remember?
Yeah, I remember that.
All right, he did.
Can I tell that story? That was a great story.
Go ahead.
So I was invited to do a installation at Peabody Essex Museum based on 100-year Jacob Lawrence. And so I was privileged to have access to his photographic archive that was in Seattle and a bunch of other material to make this environment that went with the painting. And I had his chair from his studio that was part of the archive that I was able to borrow for the installation. And when I spoke with Leslie, and she saw a picture of the installation, and she said, "You're missing something." And I said, "What?" And she was like, "A book. A book that Jacob would read. It was his favorite book." And I said, "Oh, what's the book?" And she said, "Black Metropolis." And so I went online. I think I got a first edition. I sent it to the museum. I told them to open it up, put it on the chair, and then I sent Leslie a picture. And she said, "Okay, it's done."
But these are the kinds of things that we talk about in the wee hours of the night, the morning, whatever our work ethic is, to make sure that we get the right information in the hard copy, because when the exhibition is gone and those who have missed it and those who will not have seen this live stream or this taping, do you understand that we have a record, we have the archive intact that tells the story correctly and puts it in the appropriate context so that the fault lines that we have been dealing with, everyone in America, in our history, are covered. They are addressed. Now, I know somebody is trying to tell me I need to shut my mouth, but I would like to have the panel here. And as you notice, this is sort of an atypical panel because I just didn't want to do the kind of rehearsed presentation with questions, Q&As, and things like that. And when we have individuals like this who are literally saturated, steeped in this much information, this much knowledge, this much perspective, what else do you think we could have done with this exhibition, or Where do we go from here? Look at her face.
Well,
Mike.
I have,
Oh, you have, that's right, you have the other one.
I have the other mic. I think that, I had a lot in my conversation with Barry in the catalog, 10%. I said to him, why do you think John Wilson is not better known? He's, I have a whole library at home of practically every exhibition that's ever done from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s of surveys of African American art. And John, I think, is in two, David Driscoll's 200 Centuries of African American Art, and of course, Barry Gaither's New York-Boston show from 1970. And Barry said something very interesting. He said, it's because he's a printmaker and because he didn't have a gallery in New York to be his advocate. So I think that what this exhibition does, and everybody focuses on the subject matter, but nobody really focuses on the technique. I mean, John's printing techniques are really extraordinary. And I think that we take the printed on paper image for granted because we just, flip through books, if we still do, but most of us are on our phones or computers. So I think the next step is to sort of really, have a campaign to sort of really talk about the intricacies of printmaking. I mean, every artist that I know, whether a painter, a sculptor, or something, at some point they do printmaking, and if they don't do printmaking, then they get into ceramics, and which is often very unfortunate because it looks like really bad summer camp projects. But I speak the truth. Anyway, but I think that really sort of talking about the dimensions of printmaking, we have John Wilson. We have, the Robert Blackburn, printmaking workshop, which is still going, in a heroic kind of way. In the Catlit exhibition, that we all saw recently in Brooklyn, I mean, it was like the prints and of her and her cohorts that really were saying it. I can't look at a 1930s print, particularly of someone that has, the skyline of New York with the skyscrapers, and see the way that they sort of did, without having this kind of feeling of elation and optimism that sort of goes. And I think that is really to sort of bring printmaking from the margins, in a very important way. I'm not sure, remember, I don't do prints. I mean, I'm not a print historian, but I really, I shared the other day with Joseph my pathetic, little lithograph I did when I was a curator at residence at Tamron. And it was so fascinating to me because I've drawn and I've done clay, I've done, ceramics myself. Summer camp projects. But anyway, but the whole process of sort of trying to convey an image of, a rows of necklaces with granulated beads and the textures of the beads and how to do it in not a kind of photo realistic way was such a challenge, for me to do it. So I think the next step is a really big blowout exhibition on prints. African American prints, because we know that during the WPA, the workshops that were in Philadelphia and in New York and Carol Morehouse, I think, in Cleveland, those prints that came in, you have Doc Straff, You have Raymond Steth, all of them with these incredibly innovative techniques.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's a shout out to a show that I did in 1989 at the Lehman Art Gallery called Black Printmakers in the WPA, and it was absolutely telling. John Wilson was not in that show, but John Wilson was in the Atlanta exhibitions that were organized by Hale Woodruff. They were competitions, and out of the 20-odd, and Martha Richardson is here, the gallery that represents the estate, I believe something like out of 20-odd annual competitions, John Wilson must have won 18 of the awards.
Yeah.
Thank you, Martha. More than any other artist, correct. So this is an area where we really need to do some significant research. When I was doing research for that particular exhibition, it was very clear that during the WPA, when the money was over, said and done, all of the workshops were told to close up immediately, pack up their things, and send them to usually the local library within that region. I happened to call one library to ask them if they had it. They swore they could not. Don't know what you're talking about. I said, the records indicate that you received X number of archival boxes. I said, this is my number. Call me back if you find anything. 3 weeks later, I get this frantic call. Oh my God. We went down in storage, found these boxes, dusty, dirty, closed up, that we have ignored for decades, okay? And they're in there. And this was in Philadelphia, one of the largest graphic workshops of all of the sites, which had this abundance of images, because the WPA was very interesting. They didn't really like artists. The only reason they got on the WPA and got compensation was because they were listed on the census. So they had to give them a job. They had to recognize that. And so when the artists were assigned, whether they were on the easel project, the graphics workshop project, the mural project, all they said was, do something American. Do something American. Well, when you look at those prints, what they tell you about America is absolutely amazing, because it's all what is happening today, now. So here was John Wilson, and I knew about him because I knew about the Atlanta annuals, and his work in drawing and prints were always stellar, commanding, and worthy of acknowledgement of prizes. And so you who claim you don't do prints, but you have acknowledged the importance of prints, and prints were so important. And what you also need to understand is that this period where John Wilson was working was also rife with segregation, and many black artists could not get into schools and get education. So it turns out that Mexico has the longest, most profound print traditions, because in the absence of many people not being able to read, people can identify with images and stories and narratives. And so what happened is that the black artists went to Mexico to study. That's how Wilson ended up there. All the way back to about the 16th century, they had been using this as a method to talk about the causes in their country. And this is where the great artists came from. Diego Rivera, you know? And also, too, I never understood how Diego Rivera ended up on the payroll of the WPA. when it was supposed to be only for American artists, and you had to be between the ages of 18 to 65. Well,
All the way down to, Mexico. Don't be such a United States.
look, at that time, it was not seen as the Americas.
I know.
Okay?
I'm just cautioning
This
you
is
there.
like, see, truth tellers. Truth tellers. We have known each other, all of us, on this panel so long. This panel, this is incestuous. I make no apologies. Do you understand? Because these are the people I trust the most to have these conversations. When I have something in the middle of the night, if she's not a night bird, I am, okay? So I'll write an email and I'll send it to her. But if she's up, I gotta call her, or I get an email from her. Read this to see if, in fact, I am on point or if I missed something. So we have been doing this back and forth. We check each other before we send our finished essays off to an editor who oftentimes doesn't know what the hell we are talking about. And then we have to explain to the editor why this context must be presented this particular way. I would like to thank everyone. I don't know if anyone else on my panel have wisdoms to share.
I think I've said enough.
You good? Thank you all so much for being here.